Friends, it's really a wonderful occasion that we do have the Public Health Foundation of India established, which began as a twinkle in Rajat Gupta's eyes, have ended up being the beginning of a really major institution, and I'm really grateful not only for the twinkle in Rajat's eyes, but also for the way Manmohan and the government he leads as Prime Minister has been supportive and helpful. And of course we have got outside help also, like Dr. Fleming and the outline from the Gates Foundation and elsewhere, and many institutions in the country and hopefully more from abroad. So it's a great moment. And so I'd first begin by celebrating the event, but then immediately we have to ask the question, how should we see the problem that we are approaching today? Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that there is a duality on the relation between public health and India. Public health is very important for India, but India is also very important for public health. And I want to make a few comments on both. Public health is very important for India, despite the fact that, because of the fact that even though we have had great success in many areas in medical development, in pharmaceutical, medical technology, and the finest medical care could be obtained relatively easily in India compared with almost any other country at the same level of economic development. Still, there are some major issues, and given the nature of time, I just want to mention two. One is the delivery of healthcare to the poor remains a really major problem. I was aware how big a problem it was even earlier, but because of some ground level work in which I've been involved in East India on the basis of the Protege Trust, which I was very privileged to set up in India and in Bangladesh based on the Nobel funds I had, our inquiries indicate a level of decay but first inadequacy, not enough centers, but even those exist, the level of efficiency is extraordinarily low. And I think it's very important to address this question, and in some ways we tend to get captured by ideology of two different kinds here. There is on one side a kind of resistance to take into account the incentive problem, which I think is a problem from the part of the political spectrum I see myself coming from, namely to the left of the politics of India. And in some way there's reluctance to see incentives as a really big problem, as if incentive is an issue of only efficiency. But, as Rodriguez and I tried to argue in our old book on India, that incentive is just as important for delivering equity. You have to see in what way you can make the delivery of healthcare to the poor, and this applies to education too, as we found in the Protege Trust work earlier, but now we are more involved in healthcare, that is to make sure how the doctors in the rural centers have the adequate incentive to come on time, not refer to people to private practice either of their own or of others, to provide the services which a state center should provide. And also, healthcare, we have to recognize, is really one of the classic cases discussed by Kenneth Arrow in 1973 in the American Economic Review, where the market economy has big failure, and the incentive problem that applied there apply also to public delivery. But we have to see how these issues are addressed. So that's one thing on one side. The ideology on the other side is premature reliance on private health care. I think one of the points that emerged from the literature, technical economic literature, beginning with Ken Arrow, but the Nobel that went to Joe Stiglitz and George Akerlof and Mike Spence, emphasized the issue of asymmetric information. There's no other field where the asymmetry is so great. The patient has no clue what ailment he has and what would cure. In that situation, to rely on private health care without a basic public health care to fall back on is really to invite the combination of quackery and crookery that we see today in India. There are a lot of the private doctors we found really have very little qualification, and a lot of them actually have succeeded in providing care of a kind we were amazed to find, particularly in Jharkhand, of people getting saline injection for malaria, going away with some placebo effect of feeling rather better, and being charged for it. So there's ruination going on one side, economically. On the other side, no treatment taking place. So I think the ideological thing to avoid on the left is to take the incentive question seriously, the whole issue of how to combine that with a commitment to the public, which is after all what left politics is about. On the other side, the ideological issue is that even though the private enterprise has worked very well in agriculture, and India never committed the full folly that China had in going towards communization of agriculture, but in the industries it could be being given a bigger role, and it is being given a bigger role now. Now, along with that, we have to recognize that there are areas like public health care and education, which on the basis of the history of the world, not just Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, but also England, France, Germany, Britain, I should say, America, Japan, South Korea. This is something where quintessentially the public sector has a big role. And to think that somehow this could be taken up by profit-making doctors who actually can exploit the fact that the patient is utterly ignorant. I mean, the whole asymmetric information, which was the subject of the Nobel of Akerlof and others in that, it really comes into its own in an area like this, which brings out how big a focus it is. George Akerlof's original paper on the market for lemons was actually given as a seminar in Delhi School of Economics a long time ago in 1961. It was published about 6 years later. And so there is a long history of that connection. The other problem, which I should just briefly mention, is undernutrition, which is, even though India's progress in reducing mortality has been slow, it has not been as slow as the reduction of undernourishment. Somehow we make do, nevertheless, because the medical services are not as bad as it is in some parts of the world. For example, we have a much higher undernourishment than sub-Saharan Africa has. We have a lower mortality because even though our medical services are badly delivered, the African medical services are worse delivered still. I think this comparison is very important. Gap between India and China, as I've discussed in many places, including in Economic Political Weekly, has dramatically gone down. This is not so much because we have done anything terribly good, but it's because the Chinese have messed up the delivery of healthcare pretty badly. Because I think ideology played a major part in that, in the sense that when they rightly moved away from communal agriculture and bureaucratic industries towards a more incentive-based agriculture and industrial system, they also decided to abolish public health insurance, which everyone covered 100% of the population. My estimate on the basis of whatever best I have been able to get hold of is about 10% of the Chinese now have a secure health insurance. Now, Indian thing is somewhat differently defined, and yet I would say that the gap between China and India now, taking everything into account, it's a complex story, is far less than what it was in 79. Not surprisingly, by up to 79, the Chinese life expectancy and the mortality rates were dramatically falling compared with India. But since then, even though Indians haven't gone down very fast, the Chinese have really, the mortality rates have gone down so slowly. India has had 3 times faster rate of life expectancy growth than China has since the economic reform of 79, with spectacular economic growth, world-beating economic growth. So I think the liberation from ideology is very important for us on both sides, from the point of view of looking at healthcare, undernourishment, and the care. Now, one of the benefits we do get from having a democratic system is that if you try to abolish something like a public health insurance available to all suddenly one morning in 79, you would have got nowhere. No government, even led by as great a human being as Manmohan, could not survive such a change. because this is just no way a population endowed with voting can do it. But it happened without a single newspaper protesting, without a single opposition statement. And that same problem plagues China to some extent even today, that the criticism that we see, we know how rotten the Indian health service is. The reason why I know how rotten it is because we read it in the newspapers, in the front page often, in the morning. Now that's very difficult when you don't have a freedom of press. So we have some of the system nicely going, but we have to supplement that with a liberation from the kind of old habits of thought which really have captured, which have kept us pretty badly imprisoned. Now that takes me, I shouldn't overstep my time. I think the issue of how important India is for healthcare. I think David Fleming himself pointed out how India could be used as a pathfinder. Of course, we have to find our path first before we can be treated as a pathfinder. But we have to, but it would be very important because the Indian example is very important in the world. And by the way, it's something which has really, I mean, we don't often acknowledge how big a tradition we have on that. Because the Indian history is viewed, Indian intellectual history particularly, in such spiritual terms that we miss out the main connection. Gautam Buddha left his kingdom 2,500 years ago. Why? Now, he was concerned about the shortness of life. He was concerned about the prevalence of illness. He was concerned about the infirmity of old age. All subjects in which the Public Health Institute of India, Foundation of India, can take a major interest. Now, this is not to deny that there is a spiritual dimension to it, but that dimension has been combined with basic interest. We also forget that of the people who came from China to study in India, I think of Fa Hien in early 5th century, I think of Yi Jin in 7th century, I think Zhuangzang of 6th century, 7th century again. They were all among the major things. For Yi Jin, the primary thing was medical science. He ended up by saying that the Indians admire China a lot, but they're much less willing to learn from China than we are willing to learn from India. I think that problem still remains in some sense. But the fact of the matter is that they have a real interest in knowing what was happening in India. And basically, Yi Jin's conclusion was that the medical sciences, I think still the Chinese were probably a little ahead over the Indians. And as far as delivery of healthcare is concerned, the Indians were far ahead of the Chinese. There's a lot to be learned from that. That's a kind of quick summary of the position. So I think India's example has been a matter of some interest across the world, and it remains so. Not surprising that in the WHO Commission on the Social Influences on Health, led by Sir Michael Marmot, he's the chair of the commission. I'm a member of the commission, and I'm very happy to be that and very happy to see their interest in India's experience. And I think it's not surprising some of the medical concerns that have emerged in the world, including by my friend David Barker, dealing with how maternal undernourishment and undernourishment in the womb affects not only the life of the children, but also the lives and the cardiovascular illness propensities of the adults. I know there's a lot of controversy on that, but nevertheless, it's interesting that India has been a very central issue in this. So I do hope that our foundation would succeed. I think we have got a very supportive beginning with the Prime Minister's own support and with the Health Minister's very positive and warm welcoming statement today. And we have, of course, a lot of committed individuals as well as institutions within the country and outside. So what we have already achieved and the world recognizes, like our progress in pharmaceutical, our progress in medical technology, could actually be combined with what had been, Yi Jin thought, the traditional field of advantage of India, namely a delivery system of healthcare, from which the Chinese had something to learn. So I think there is, if you think of it as a two-way process, there's really reason to be excited about what's going on here now. And thank you very much to you all for coming.